G'day everybody, how are you going today? It's so good to see you. I do hope that you are super well. Today I want to talk about the future. I want to speculate on what might we see from some of the big players in the camera industry. As we know, Fuji have been doing a little bit in recent times with the X-H2S, and they have the X-H2 coming soon. Canon, well, they've been flexing their muscles in the crop sensor space, which I think is interesting for, say, Nikon D500 users. They might be looking over that way a little bit. Sony, well, let's face it, in 2022, Sony haven't done very much when it comes to cameras. They have released a few lenses. And then, well, there's Nikon with the Z9. And that's probably, well, it did ship at the very end, the 24th of December 2021, but essentially it is a 2022 camera. What is the next year or two going to look like? What should we expect in the R1, the A1? Will there be an A1 II soon? What are Nikon going to do? Let's speculate on those things in this video. We do have currently the Fuji X-H2S with a 40 megapixel camera allegedly coming in the X-H2. We have the A1, 50 megapixels, 30 frames per second RAW, although that is not a 14-bit RAW, it is reduced. I've done a bit of a deep dive on that and it seems to be something like 12.75 bits, not 14-bit. We have the Canon R3. Of course, the Canon R1 is not here yet. There's no sign of that, and there is speculation that we will have a development announcement fourth quarter this year, which would make me think we're not going to see it for another year after that. So probably something like this time or later next year. And of course we have the Z9 from Nikon. Now, what is the summation of all of these things? Well, right now, I think the two most urgent cameras that we need are from Canon and from Sony. Obviously, we need the R1 to satiate those people who are looking for a Z9-like experience. And, well, the A1. The A1, I don't know whether it's going to get any more firmware updates. It's been in the market now for not quite a year and a half, but heading towards a year and a half, and there's been not a lot to come out of Sony in the way of major enhancements for that camera. So does that mean the A1 is at its limit? There's not much more they can do with it? And does that mean that the A1 version 2 is the most likely thing that we will see next? What can we expect from the Sony A1 version 2? When currently the Sony A1 is a pretty spectacular camera. It is 50 megapixels, 20 frames per second, full 14-bit, everything you can possibly want, the full enchilada. And at 30 frames per second RAW, we're getting something like 12.5 bits, as I said before, and again, everything's firing. We get 8K for a fairly long time, not as long as the Z9, of course. The Z9 is the leader in that space at the moment when it comes to 35mm handheld hybrid cameras. So the Sony A1 is a pretty amazing camera at this point in time. And the Canon R1, well, what's that going to be? I think Canon will be taking a lot of cues from the Nikon Z9. It's got to be 8K. It's got to be, well, who knows, frames per second when the Canon R3 has just come out with 195 frames per second, except it only goes for a quarter of a second. So it's actually 50 frames per quarter of a second. And then it takes something like 8 seconds for the buffer to be emptied and put onto the card before you can actually shoot again. So look, that's great marketing. And we'd like to see the R1 actually doing that for a sustained period of time, maybe for a couple of seconds, and writing to the buffer much quicker. It's easy to see that the Canon R1 will be 8K. It'll shoot 8K RAW like a Z9, and it's going to be shooting, I'm going to guess, somewhere between 50 and 100 frames per second in RAW for a sustained period of time, not a quarter of a second. And maybe it'll do something like 195 frames per second, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure how necessary that is. Perhaps it could get up to something like 120 frames a second like the Z9 does. And then we have the recently released Fuji. Now, the recently released X-H2S, very complicated name, hard to remember. It seems to be a fantastic all-rounder camera. It simply cannot exist on the same level as a Z9 and A1 and whatever the R1 will be, because it's an APS-C sensor. But if you want to get into this sort of high-level stuff where it's doing a lot of what these cameras can do, except it does it in 6K, for example, instead of doing it in 8K, it's pretty close. But really, from my perspective, I want to leave the Fuji out of this discussion because it is not a 35mm full-frame camera. And then in all of this, well, we have the Z9. And the Z9, well, it continues to be a new camera every 3 or 4 or 5 months. We've had firmware 2.0, which gave us raw, full-frame, 8.3K recording up to 60 frames per second in 12-bit. This is ridiculous. It's amazing at this price point. It shoots raw 14-bit files at 20 frames per second. But let's just have a little quick look at the fact that right now, we can have 12-bit raw video at 60 frames per second. 12-bit raw video. So why is it not potentially possible that we can have 12-bit raw stills at 60 frames per second? It almost seems like exactly the same thing to me. So I think there's a chance that the Z9 could have more boosts and more firmware coming, because this machine seems to have been thought about and engineered from the ground up to be something new, something special, and absolutely push the envelope of photography. And we're getting a sense of some of that DNA from the interviews that we've had with the team that actually produced the Z9. And we've also recently had a teardown of the Z9 where we can see the lengths that they've gone to ensure that it can record 8K video with the enormous heatsink that's inside the camera, and the efforts that they've gone to have the pathway between the sensor and the storage and the EVF all super highways. As I've said time and time again, since the moment that I started shooting with this camera, it has been built for speed, it's been built for the future. It's literally a sensor, storage, and a CPU. And from my perspective, it's hard to see the limits of what they can do to push this thing around up until they get to the absolute limits of the CPU, the sensor, and the buffer/storage. I feel like we've got a little bit further to go in this journey. In a way, I feel like we've already had the Z9 II, and I don't think there'll be any new hardware in the Z9 space. And the most interesting things hardware-wise we're going to see from Nikon is going to be the Z8 or Z7 III or whatever we have coming next. So here is my speculation for what I think is probably going to happen in 2023. I think late 2023, we're going to have a Canon R1, mid to late. I think late and maybe even into early 2024, we will have some sort of either major update, firmware update to the A1, or we're simply just going to have the A1 version 2. I feel like if we were going to have a major update to the Sony A1 firmware, we probably would have seen that by now, considering everything that's going on in the Nikon space. As for the Z9, you know, I kind of, as I said, we've got raw video shooting at 60 frames per second in 12-bit. I've got no reason to believe that we can't get more stills out of that camera. So I do feel like the Z9 still got a little bit more wriggle room to go because of that 8K 60 12-bit raw video, and I think we could get further with JPEGs beyond 120 frames per second. Who knows? Pre-capture, a lot of people want to see pre-capture in the RAW space, not just in the JPEG space. So I still think the Z9 will continue to be advanced for a little while to come. I feel like there's more there. And, well, Fuji, they're going to give us the X-H2, which will be a 40 megapixel camera. There's speculation as to whether that'll be a stack sensor or not. I think that's a high resolution camera. But by the time we have the Z9 fully matured, the A1 version 2 and the R1, and these will all be mid to late, roughly next year, let's say a year to 18 months from now, there's really no camera system, there's no camera, there's no flagship camera at that point in time that isn't absolutely magnificent. Do I see megapixels increasing? I don't see them increasing in this flagship space because the flagships are all-rounder cameras. You want them to be very fast, and you want them to be able to shoot sports, and you want them to be able to do journalism, and you just don't want your files getting to 60 or 80 megapixels. It's just simply too much. I think this is where we're going to settle, between the 45 and 50 megapixel space for these types of cameras, and I really do think Fuji are trying to reach into it with the X-H2 at 40 megapixels. Another aspect that we need to look at is how much further can chips go. As I talked about in a recent video, we've got Sigma working on the Fovean sensor, which is a different way of doing things, but it has its pros and cons because of its RGB stack. So what does the future hold? What sort of developments can we expect? What else is in the pipeline? There are all sorts of ideas and patents looming, but what, if any of those, will be brought to mass market? We've gone from CCD to CMOS, CMOS to backside illuminated CMOS, and now we've got stacked backside illuminated CMOS sensors. These are a lot of developments just over the last 10 or so years. What else will we get? I think ultimately, in the short term, in the next couple of years, and with the cameras that we're currently talking about, I don't think we're going to see much in the way of major changes, and any changes we will see moving forwards, I think, are going to be relatively small, and certainly not enough to make anybody at this Z9, A1, R1 level change system. So what do you think? Is my speculation a load of bollocks, or does it have a ring of truth about it? Who knows? We have some technological pointers, we have marketing imperatives, we have the desire for market share and market dominance. Certainly Canon and Sony want to be there at the top, and I'm positive that the Canon R1 will be an absolute monster. It just really is, from a Canon perspective, when's it going to come? Like, it's amazing from my perspective that this flagship will potentially come out almost 3 years after the Sony A1 came out. I will repeat what I said before. I think at that point, when we have the A1, the Z9 and the R1, when we have all of those cameras, there really will not be any sense of any manufacturer or any person feeling like they don't have the best possible camera in hand. And I really have to say, this feels a little bit like when we got to the F5 and the equivalent in the film era, where film cameras reached basically their zenith. They got to the top of where they could go. I wonder what the future holds for cameras beyond speed of acquisition of focus and frames per second. As I said in a previous video, I hope we don't get into a frame war. I think we're already in the raw frame war. I think it's started, but I think it'll stop a lot quicker. Already we're getting up to some very, very high numbers. This is a speculation piece. It's not about right or wrong. I would love to know what your thoughts are in the comments below. So please do give me a sense of where you think the market's going to be going. And I look forward to seeing you very soon. So please, if this is your first time here, please subscribe. I'd love to see you again. Please like and share, and I'll see you soon.